Tonight we discuss the story of a 24-year-old college student who abruptly went missing, leaving behind a room full of symbols, 14 handwritten encoded manuscripts, and the entire world scratching their heads. But first, a quick word on behalf of today's sponsor, Skillshare, an online learning community for creators featuring 25,000 classes in design, business, and more. I get asked all the time for advice on how to start a YouTube channel, and if this is something you've wondered for yourself, then I highly suggest taking the course by fellow YouTuber Draw with Jazza. He walks you through everything from thumbnails all the way to AdSense, everything you need to know to get started. Skillshare is giving away a free 2-month unlimited access trial to all of my subscribers who click the link in the description box down below. After that, it's only around $10 a month for access to courses on just about everything you can think of. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring, and with that said, on to the show. Bruno Borges was described by his family as intelligent. The philosophy student loved reading, so much so that according to relatives, he was capable of burning through 15 books a month. But he also loved writing. On March 27, 2017, Bruno had gone missing from his family home in Brazil, but not before covering his bedroom entirely with characters and symbols. Every inch of it, from floor to ceiling, had been marked. Upon inspection, it was discovered that Bruno left behind 14 manuscripts, all of which were encoded and, much like the walls, hand-done. Accompanying the manuscripts and writing on the walls were diagrams, images, and most fixated on by the media, a painting of Bruno and an alien, both wearing cloaks, and a statue of philosopher Giordano Bruno. Upon the news of Bruno's disappearance and the discovery of his bizarre room, the media and internet alike were abuzz. Theories were being thrown left and right as to what it all meant, many convinced that Bruno was involved with some kind of secret society or maybe something even more. Others, however, were not so convinced. Bruno meanwhile remained missing, and the police as well as the public began investigating. If you remember the story from back when it was breaking, then you may not know what happened next or the greater details of the case, including Bruno's eventual reappearance, all of which will be covered in this video. But first, who exactly was Bruno Borges? Unfortunately, not much is known about the man aside from things that came up during the investigation. Again, Bruno was 24 at the time, a resident of Brazil and studying philosophy. We do know that he lived with relatives, his mother, father, and a few siblings, including a twin brother. According to the family, Bruno's mother and father had been away on a trip for almost a month before returning home, only to find their son missing. Bruno's siblings note that during the time span where their parents were away, Bruno had locked himself in his room and stopped eating regularly, to the point of noticeably losing weight. Bruno's disappearance in itself was, of course, a mystery and a legal one at that, but the public were much more entranced by his bizarre bedroom, which had been gutted and painted white before being covered in coded messages. Needless to say, it quickly overshadowed the public's interest in Bruno's whereabouts. As mentioned earlier, Bruno had left behind 14 handwritten manuscripts, each numbered by a Roman numeral, and while a lot of details are unclear, it's a general consensus that what we see on the walls here are copies of the coded manuscripts. With all that said, what did these messages say, and what do they mean? It's important that I point out that there are a few different types of code used, but none of them were necessarily all that complicated. More on that later. Some translations of Bruno's writing have surfaced online. Here's an example. Unsurprisingly, the writing mostly centers on philosophy, Bruno's major at the time if you'll recall. This theme is also echoed in the room's centerpiece, a full-size statue of Giordano Bruno, who, according to Wikipedia, lived in the late 1500s and was known for being a mathematician, poet, cosmological theorist, and philosopher. On the 17th of February 1600, he was executed in Rome after being charged with blasphemy and heresy, amongst others. He also happened to be one of Bruno's favorites. One might even argue that Bruno was even obsessed with the man. During all the media madness, many pointed out the eerie coincidence of both men having the name Bruno while sharing what they considered a striking resemblance. This, of course, can only be chalked up to coincidence, but the more you look into this historical figure, the more and more you begin to see where Bruno drew his inspiration from. Like I mentioned earlier, this painting was found amongst the chaos of Bruno's abandoned bedroom. We see Bruno alongside a stereotypical alien, the two dressed in cloaks. But what does any of this have to do with a 16th century philosopher? Giordano Bruno was known for his belief in life on other planets, something that definitely contributed to his eventual trial and execution by the church. As you can see, based on this monument of the philosopher at the site of his execution, Giordano was often depicted exactly how Bruno chose to showcase him, wearing a cloak. The initial media coverage surrounding Bruno's room described him as an alien enthusiast, and while this may not necessarily be untrue, I do think it's important to note that aliens in this case were secondary next to the focus on Giordano and his work. Under the statue of Giordano is this circle. It's one of many that articles and confused onlookers have described as satanic or Illuminati related. First of all, based on everything I've seen here, there is nothing satanic depicted in this room, and I'm not going to bother with the Illuminati stuff. What these symbols actually are appear to be rooted in alchemy, which does cross paths with philosophy during Giordano's time period. Before you weebs step in, Full Metal Alchemist wasn't where alchemy was invented. Yes, it was an actual field of study once upon a time. Yes, there were symbols and circles involved. Look it up. At the end of the day, though, my point here is that what may seem esoteric on the surface is actually right in line with a running theme. What I'm trying to say is, from where I'm standing, Bruno Borges' room is a shrine dedicated to Giordano Bruno and his legacy. But why? After 5 months missing, Bruno returned home. No big reveal, no tales of kidnapping. The man just showed up. The media quickly began to buzz about Bruno yet again, and with his return came the expectation that we'd be getting a clear explanation of what happened, but that's not exactly how things played out. Once Bruno began speaking to the media, he proved as eccentric as his project would lead you to believe. He admitted to leaving his home by his own accord, telling reporters that he'd gone on somewhat of a soul search, an attempt to uncover the meaning of life. In a translated article from G1, Bruno states the following: "I was aware that the Philosopher's Stone was within the Dark Land, so I went after entering that Dark Land to find it. Just as the hero enters the cave to slay a dragon, and Jonah has entered a whale, so have I dived into the sea of the unconscious to rescue me." By this point, a ton of other info surrounding the case had surfaced, such as the identity of the person who created the statue of Giordano. Surprisingly, it was made by an 83-year-old man who told the media that he was certain that Bruno was the philosopher reincarnated, destined to complete the work he'd started hundreds of years ago. The weirdness continues with a Reddit post that translates a good amount of the local media coverage surrounding Bruno and the investigation of his disappearance. They note that the day Bruno left home, he did so on foot with a backpack and hard drive, only to get into a taxi approximately 1 kilometer later. Bruno was soon dropped off at a motel, one conveniently located next to a heavily wooded area known for hosting bonfires and other late-night gatherings. The post mentions a witness, one described as a passerby who spoke of receiving an invitation to some kind of ritual taking place in the aforementioned woods. A local dressmaker chimed in, saying she was commissioned by Bruno to make 3 cloaks, similar to the ones depicted in the images of Giordano. An unidentified friend of Bruno admits to being present during the almost month-long period where the writing and other material was created. He also brings up how Bruno had stopped eating, much like his siblings claimed. There was no mention of whether or not the friend assisted in creating the room, but one can assume that Bruno had help aside from the sculptor. Also noted by various sources are comments made by Bruno's mother, who claims that Bruno had asked her for financial help with a project prior to his disappearance. Upon refusing to admit what the project was about, Bruno's mother opted to not allow him the funds, which he was later able to acquire from a cousin. And while the exact amount is unknown, it's said that Bruno was able to secure the equivalent of roughly $6,000. At some point between this and Bruno disappearing, he did mention to his mother that he was writing 14 books that would have a major impact on society, an impact that he insisted would be a positive one. Here's where things get really interesting. In June of 2017, while Bruno was still missing, a friend of his had gotten into legal trouble, and as a result, had his residence searched by authorities. Within his home were contracts that detailed a splitting of profits to be made from the sale of one of Bruno's books. Bruno's cousin, the one who agreed to fund his mystery project, was also cited in the contract. It was at this point, before Bruno even showed back up again, that police concluded that Bruno had not been kidnapped or hurt, but simply left. The entire thing assumed and pretty much confirmed to be a hoax set in place to get rich quick. So this is where we are today. Most look back at the Bruno Borges story as a simple hoax. Some have even gone on record as calling it desperate, an unknown writer's attempt at clawing his way into relevancy. While this very well may be true, there is still something odd about the entire situation. We know that Bruno's cousin and at least one of his friends planned to profit from this, but what about everyone else? Did they know about everything that was going on? Were all these little mentions of how intelligent and eccentric Bruno was all for show, even by those not guaranteed a cut of the money? Were Bruno's parents and siblings really unaware of what was going on, or were they all in it from the start? There's no doubt that the so-called disappearance was meant to stir up attention, but the way I see it, hoax aside, there are two possible avenues right now. Either Bruno is just really dedicated to the idea of this marketing stunt, or he really is obsessed with Giordano Bruno to the point of basing his entire identity on him. Most at this point seem split in their opinions. On one hand, some suspect Bruno of suffering from schizophrenia because, marketing stunt aside, his explanations to things make little sense. While there's definitely nothing related to aliens or the supernatural going on here, many just don't see the logic in most things surrounding the case and can only attribute it to the possibility that Bruno might just be a little unwell. But again, this is only if there's any truth in anything his family said. The Reddit post translating local coverage of Bruno did note comments made by various professionals, both in security and psychiatry. They point out that the codes were actually just simple substitutions, and that everything surrounding this story point to some kind of mental break, with Bruno suffering from delusions of grandeur, believing that his work could change the world. This is only further demonstrated by Bruno's clear obsession with Giordano Bruno, as we discussed a second ago. So, where is Bruno now? As it turns out, he's right where we left him. Just a couple of weeks ago, he decided to open up his room to the public, still maintaining that everything was done in an attempt to enlighten himself and the public. He stresses that he made no money from the project, and even has a website where he published his work for free. Upon visiting the site, you'll find the following statement. It describes Bruno as a self-taught mystic, citing a mystical experience when he was 20 as the catalyst for all that followed. The second paragraph reads as follows. Returning home from his spiritual retreat after completing the Enzo project, Bruno Borges denied fame, refusing more than 100 proposals to appear on televised networks or internet channels. He also refused to make his work a way of making money by refusing to participate in advertisements he was offered, famous brands that would pay him up to $50,000. He is currently demonstrating in court that he had made no profit from his project, and that getting rich and famous with philosophy books and studies has always been an absurdity preached by sensationalist media who believe that everyone only targets money, as they mostly ironically do. For Bruno, art must be produced in order to awaken people, and for him, unfortunately, the vast majority of artists who are praised in our country produce content that, instead of awakening, alienates. So, is Bruno Borges a con man, someone suffering a severe mental break, or just a very eccentric artist? I'll leave that decision up to you, and with that all said, thank you so much for watching, and shout out to Patreon supporters Matt, Jenny, and Mark Annan, along with anyone else who supports me there. I'll see you all again soon. Ish.